illustrator and scholar D.B. Dowd was first approached to write a history of illustration, he told me, he flatly declined because he wasn't convinced that illustration had an appropriate sense of its own historical evolution, a broader awareness of its own development within some clearly established understanding of what it actually was. Years later, he was approached once again, and this time said to himself, if I can wrap my head around this and come up with an appropriately meaningful narrative of what illustration is and how it has evolved, I'll do it. Ultimately, the solution he hit upon, the fundamental aspect of illustration that grounded his entire project, was his conclusion that it is reading that is, as he put it, the central activity illustration enables, enlivens, and clarifies, and to which it adds delight, naturally paving the way for him to captivatingly explore the many fascinating aspects of how text and images have combined to enhance the reading experience across a wide number of domains. So now that we understand the title, it's time to dig a little deeper. Douglas Dowd, welcome to Exploring Art History.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I'd like to talk about your motivations for writing and creating reading pictures. So when did that idea occur to you and how did it develop?
Well, I've been working with these materials as an academic for 25 years. And I've been around, my background is interesting in the sense that I was a BA in history.
Oh.
I took some art classes and actually did a lot of theater, but and I sort of always knew that I was an artist and a writer, but I was not. So I wasn't really acculturated to fine art as a young person, in the sense of, I didn't take the art history survey. I didn't.
Right.
But I also didn't go to design school, and illustration is sometimes situated in fine arts department, but it belongs in the culture of design. So I didn't imbibe any of the biases of art, which are quite substantial, nor did I absorb the resentments that have often attended the field of illustration. So I came upon this stuff as a more mature person, and I was involved I was asked, an alumnus of Washington University, who had been a very famous illustrator between 1940 and 1960, a guy named Al Parker. He had passed away in the 80s, and late 90s, his youngest son, Kit Parker, contacted the school to see if we would want his father's career materials. And I was trained as a printmaker. At that point, I was kind of transitioning into illustration and design, but I was still a neophyte. And but I had a relationship with the library at WashU, which has continued to develop and became a big part of my career. But so along with my colleague Jeff Pike, who was an illustrator and then the dean of the school, the two of us went off to see Kit Parker's garage, which had his father's stuff in it. And these were largely gouache on board paintings from the middle of the century. And they were strikingly intelligent, beautifully designed and crafted, but they portrayed a kind of pre-Betty Friedan world of domestic relations, kind of a cult of family life. He also did a lot of advertising, and I remember standing in that garage on a rainy day, looking at these things and thinking, what on earth am I looking at? Like, how would you think about these artifacts? How would you write about these artifacts? And I didn't know the answer. We ultimately accepted that collection, which became the cornerstone of what is now a major research archive. And that question, like, what is this? And how would you think about it coherently? Kind of became the animating question of my career. So, because I had not imbibed all kinds of biases and bitterness, or like what all the things that one could have, I kind of wandered into the room of professional illustration-ish studies people, and I just had a different point of view, but it took a long time. It evolved over a long period of time. So I had a conversation about writing a book very much like this with Michelle Comey, who is the publisher and editor of Princeton's Art and Architecture and Urban Studies catalog, in like 2015. And she asked me to take on a project of this kind. And I said no. And the reason I said no was, I'm really not convinced that illustration has a history. It has a past, but I did not feel as if it had developed a historiography. Like it didn't have a theory of itself. And then I had another conversation with her a number of years later, after we had started a graduate program at WashU, which is the MFA in Illustration and Visual Culture, where I had been teaching these incoming grads about the history and culture of illustration, kind of as best I could, not from a text, but from my own, the resources I was pulling together. Because there are, in the last 10 years, there have been some interesting books. One, most notably, History of Illustration, which was published by Fairchild and edited by Susan Doyle and Jolene Grove and Whitney Sherman. But that book, it's a big fat thing, and it's enormous, and it's expensive, and it's kind of a reference work as opposed to a narrative that someone could enter. Anyway, long story short, I finally got to the point where, like, okay, if I can wrap my head around this and come up with a thesis that justifies spending this much time on it, I'll agree to do it. Ultimately, I did, and I did.
You're better placed than I am to answer this question, and Michelle's obviously better placed still. But my guess is one of the reasons why she was interested in the idea that you would create this is exactly the sense of objectivity that you mentioned earlier, that you come from a different background, that you're able to look from a height, as it were, metaphorically, on the lay of the land, and be able to identify but not necessarily feel this overwhelming academic allegiance to strands of cultural history and illustration and design, and maybe be able to synthesize and interpret this, because there's an awful lot going on. There are a lot of different strands at play here. So that's my speculation anyway. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, that's a generous characterization. I guess we'll see what people make of this book. But that, if it has merit, I think it's fair to say that That's an unusual perspective, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and not to mention being an illustrator yourself, which I think shouldn't be um, undervalued or taken for granted. I mean, it's one thing to have an academic perspective, and you obviously do, but it's another thing to actually have been involved significantly in the creative process. And maybe that's all very standard in this field. I don't pretend to know, but my guess is that's essential to embark on the sort of project that you've embarked on. Would that be reasonable or not so much?
Um, I whether it's essential or not, I think is for somebody else to decide. I think it's valuable. Fields which have not been blessed with uh, status, like cartooning and illustration, have always tended to the first histories or the first attempt to build a narrative almost always comes from the practitioners because there's nobody else doing it.
Yeah.
And so if you scratch the surface of, I mean, the three authors I just mentioned of the Fairchild book, they're all illustrators and designers. So
A reaction from somebody like myself who I can pretend complete objectivity, which is to say that I have almost unlimited ignorance when it comes to this field, is that it's a bit off-putting in many ways because you're searching for a definition, you're searching for a more formal structure. That's perhaps part of my own, I guess, biases or orientation. And yet you're constantly encountering all these different captivating aspects and details, and you're trying to make sense of it and put it in a structure. So let me try to be a little bit more specific. So one thing that surprised me right at the very outset is here I'm reading what seems like a history, and yet is not presented in a chronological fashion. And my interpretation of this is that you're trying to point out interesting thematic commonalities rather than this sort of one damn thing after another historical approach. And and that was both intriguing to me and to some extent, as I said before, discomforting. Did you have that in mind, this idea of pushing the reader outside of his or her comfort zone right from the very beginning, or was that just the obvious way to do the book for you, and you just went ahead and unhesitatingly did it?
um, that's a very good question. I wrote one introduction early in the process, and when the book went out for peer review, there were questions, valid questions, about, well, what is this? What is this book trying to do? And then the questions that would follow would be based on, presumably from the reviewer's perspective, if I were writing this book, it would do this. And why doesn't it do this?
Right.
And so I had to go back at the end and write a kind of, I mean, I always try to write accessibly, but a kind of polite jujitsu um, uh, exercise in saying, this is what this book is attempting to do. This is what this book is not attempting to do.
Right.
And by and large, histories of illustration have been chronicles of talented people who encountered technical and commercial challenges and made beautiful things, and you get, it's sort of decade by decade. I could not possibly write that text. First of all, there would be no reason to because there are lots of them.
Right.
But secondly, I started with I have had for some time a kind of abiding frustration with the fact that illustration doesn't have enough of a literature. And because it doesn't have enough of a literature which expresses core interest in what it is and does, it's often written about in the context of what it isn't. So what it isn't is a Kantian disinterested aesthetic experience. It isn't one of the 7 liberal arts. Its mongrel status is core to what it is.
Right.
And what makes it mongrel is that, and this is the thing that the reason I agreed to write the book is that I said, I'm going to think about this for a month. And if I can come up with a thesis after a month, then I'll agree to do it. And if I can't, I won't. And one of the things I read during that month was Mangruel's History of Reading, which was a great, very, very engaging text. And it historicized the act of reading in an interesting way. And not just reading, not just committing words and characters to paper that someone could then decode, but the reading had all kinds of different phases. At first, it was just recording a speech so that someone could read it later, speak it aloud later. In other words, it was an aid to an oral experience. Over time, the practice of private reading evolved, which to this day still freaks lots of people out. Like, what ideas are you absorbing while you're reading that book that I may not approve of? So the core fact of illustration to me ultimately was, right, it's reading. It's connected to reading. And if you're not reading, it's just artwork. So the reading experience, which includes the text and the image and other visual, they don't have to be pictorial, but produces the total experience, which, as it turned out, as over the last several centuries, the visual dimensions of that and the act of looking as a counterpart to the act of reading became very important.
In keeping with what you said, my sense is that not just the text of the book and the thematic orientation in the thesis, but also the layout of the book, how it was structured, how it was done in such a way that it incorporates this mixture of text and images, was also deliberate to force the reader to confront that idea, to confront the core ideas that you're interested in projecting. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, and the book is beautifully designed, which I had nothing to do with. I have been intimately involved in the design of books I've produced. This was not one of them, although I had lots of input about what went where, but the design team did a fabulous job. And also I think the printing and the color of the reproductions, I mean, it's just a beautiful book. And I can't claim credit for any of that, but I agree. The way it's presented makes it easier to access the ideas.
Yeah. You highlight images and illustrations from East Asia, from North America, from Europe. And so I have a two-part question coming up with that. In the first case, it struck me that This field, broadly defined, and we have to define it broadly, is one which naturally lends itself to aspects of global history. My sense is that you had particular experience or orientation with aspects of the Asian world from many of the examples that you bring out.
I had an opportunity to go to Shanghai in 2011 because I was interested in a particular episode in the late Qing dynasty when um, the first newspaper published in China, the first daily newspaper, was owned by British interests, but was written by Chinese and illustrated by Chinese. And there was such a thing as an illustrated supplement, what became kind of the Sunday comics. Publishers around the world were visualizing current events, and specifically the illustrated press, wood engraving beginning in the 1840s. The Japanese and Chinese in East Asia were reading or looking at the London Illustrated News. So there's a fascinating period where Shenbao, which was the paper that Ernest Major founded, they tried to create a supplement that would succeed. It took until the mid 1880s. Dian Shizai Hobao, which is a pictorial. And I was fascinated by this is maybe a little in the weeds, but I'm fascinated by how people engage technology and culture. I think we think of technology as too determinative. I don't think it is. I think technology sticks when it serves a cultural need and doesn't when it doesn't. But Wu Yoru, who was kind of the best of the illustrators working in Shanghai for Major, and then he started his own publication. He was drawing the Chinese from the 7th century, 8th century, were producing books using xylography, which just means cutting blocks, which included pictures and text on the same surface. They really didn't stop doing that until the arrival of lithography in the 1860s. So Wu Yoru was producing lithographs that looked like wood engravings because that's what he had seen. He was mimicking wood engraving, except when he would draw backgrounds, and then that looked like traditional Chinese painting. Just really a fascinating mixed episode. When I was in China trying to explore this, and I sort of understood this, but like that's a period that the Chinese regard as shameful, when the Europeans were tramping around in the treaty ports and had their own territory, etc. So I couldn't find many people who would agree to being interested in them. But I'm fascinated when cultures come together and people are trying to figure out how to manage in this new mixed circumstance. There was some stuff I wrote about in the 1670s and 80s around the Great Lakes, and how when the Iroquois suffered a smallpox outbreak, they launched a series of mourning wars to attack other tribes and then adopt their captives. They'd ritually execute half of them and then they'd adopt the other half. And they rebuilt their community through conquest. But they drove all these Algonquin tribes up against the edge of the Great Lakes. And there were French voyageurs who were, and French clergy who were in. There was this crazy couple decades where the French and Algonquin Indians were trying to figure out what had happened to them because they were dislocated, trying to figure out how to work this out in the same place. That got cut because it was too much. But at any rate, these mixed moments I find really interesting.
I'd like to move back to what you said about the anecdote with Dickens and Robert Seymour, because I think that's really fascinating. Maybe I can ask you to elaborate on that incident and that tension between Dickens and Seymour, because I think it seemed to have really been a profound moment in terms of the prioritization of text and image.
The rise of caricature in Britain during the Georgian era, which followed Hogarth, created a class of people who were popular entertainers, and they were sort of journalists, but they were mostly satirists. Gilray and Rowlandson, for example, could be coaxed into having one approach or another approach, depending on the party. But they created this new form of amusement and political speech that there was a large market emerged. Actually, the print markets of London were a big deal as early as the London Fire in 1666. So the print markets were a big deal. Caricature built on that market and created popular following for funny pictures with texts and the texts were structural. I mean, there would be maybe a title at the bottom, but they weren't exactly speech bubbles yet, but little breathy things that suggested somebody might be saying something. So the caricaturists had kind of ruled the roost specifically in England, because the Royal Academy came late to England. Hogarth beat Joshua Reynolds, and the Hogarthian tradition was firmly established in Britain before the Royal Academy opened, which was not true in France or Italy.
Right.
So the caricaturists were they built a following, and publishing in the early 19th century, it was as likely that a publisher might want to build a project on a caricaturist as on an author. So a famous example is The Tours of Dr. Syntax, which is a Thomas Rowlandson project written by William Combe. But the publisher secured the services of Rowlandson first. In the case of the Pickwick Papers, the same thing happened. In 1835, Robert Seymour was a caricaturist. He started out as a painter. It didn't go that well. He kind of evolved into a caricaturist. But he had a hit in 1835 called Sketches of Seymour, which were these little pamphlets showing guys who were, Londoners in nice clothes going hunting and fishing. And they were ridiculous, and they often, they drank too much, and they didn't really know what they were doing, and they were amusing. So there were gags about rich guys going fishing and hunting. Chapman and Hall, who were two people who launched a publishing venture because publishing was beginning to really emerge as a major business, they see Seymour's sketches and think, this guy's good, let's do a book with him. So one of them approaches Seymour. They talk to him about this project. We like your hunters and fishers and fishermen. Let's do something. Why don't you start working on some ideas for that? And we'll find some writer who will write some stuff to go with your caricatures. Like a month or two later, one of them goes to see Dickens, who's 24 years old. He just published Sketches by Boz, which had been illustrated by George Cruikshank. And they asked him, hey, we've got this guy who's drawing funny pictures about guys going fishing. We want you to write the text. And Dickens who had lived in kind of grueling urban circumstances, didn't know anything about hunting and fishing, couldn't have cared less, but he needed the work. So he said, I'll do it, but I'm not really doing hunting and fishing. And by the way, I'm not writing up to somebody's caricatures. Like, I'll write you a story and it'll be good. And we can have some pictures, but that's how I'm going to approach this. So two guys are working independently, thinking that they're in charge of the project, which became the posthumous pictures of the Pickwick Club. And after the first volume appears, Dickens sees some proofs of illustrations for the second volume and thinks, this is, I don't like where this is going. So he arranges a meeting. The two of them meet. And Seymour, who's like in his 40s, and he's kind of a prickly guy. And Dickens is this 24-year-old kind of wonder king. And Dickens just overwhelms him. And his force of will emerges, and basically Dickens is art directing Seymour, saying, okay, two of these are fine. The other two, they need work. Let's do this again. And Seymour's completely freaked out because he thought he was running the project. So he goes home and he tries to fix one of them, and he actually ruins it, and is in a state. And the next morning gets up, goes out to his garden, and fires a shotgun blast through his chest. Dead. So the writer won rather decisively. And that's a story that captures the relationship between pictures and novels. And the novelists had the stronger position as things evolved. There's a moment. So that's 1836. One of the most important novels for the history of illustration is Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. And there's a moment where Scott is outed. He'd written them pseudonymously. He's outed as the author of what are called the Waverley novels. There are like 14 of these novels, Ivanhoe being one of them, and which is kind of a celebrity event. And so his publisher decides, okay, we're gonna reprint. We're going to do a new edition of all of Scott, of the Waverley novels, and we're going to do illustrations. There'll be an illustrated frontispiece, and there'll be an illustrated title page. That's what an illustrated book meant. And that became a sensation. And then another set of Robert Bentham did a series of novels, including Jane Austen's novels. She had published anonymously, and kind of nobody knew who she was until he started publishing these novels in 1833 with illustrations. So the illustration has an impact on interest in a book. Books with pictures in them were just cooler objects. And so because books that were just books of landscapes didn't sell very well. So it was the intersection. Reading and looking were mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things came to mind with this Dickens anecdote in particular. The first is, how come I've never heard of this before? I thought this is a fascinating, interesting story, which really should be in the public consciousness. And maybe I'm just completely out to lunch, but I had certainly never heard of this idea before. And I think it's very revealing in a number of ways. First and foremost, obviously, as you said, the writer one, there was this notion that illustrators and illustration would be henceforth subordinate to the written text or the writer or what have you. But then it seems to me there might be some other subtle aspects to this as well, which is, okay, the writer won, but when I think of Dickens, I think of somebody who is an incredibly visual writer. Even if there are no illustrations whatsoever, I think of all of the Dickensian canon as being particularly visually rich and suitable for illustration, for films. It's not a coincidence that these texts, which are incredibly long often and incredibly intricate, have so often been not just illustrated, but made into films and theatrical productions and so forth and so on. It seems to me that it might be the case that that was just the way that one wrote and imbibed at the time, and because there were so many illustrations, illustrated texts, and you mentioned Ivanhoe and so forth, that was all just part of what it meant to be a writer. But it might also have been the case that even though he won that particular argument, he was strongly influenced, maybe even subconsciously, by the power of illustration. Is that plausible, you think?
Yes, it is plausible. He actually talked about the power of seeing. There was a publication called The Terrible Register in the 1820s. It was an early, kind of a sordid version of the Illustrated News, kind of like Penny Dreadfuls. And he wrote about the dread, the excitement and dread of seeing pictures of some executed guy or a murder victim, or these sordid representations had a big impact on him. Yeah. And I can tell you, I didn't know that story until I started digging a little bit.
Really? Okay, well, that makes me feel better anyway.
Yeah, but right. How don't we all know that story? We don't know that story, I think, because illustration is, and we'll maybe end up talking about this in a different number of different dimensions. It can be invisible. Like, you consume it without necessarily thinking about it. You don't stand in an art museum and look at a big illustration on the wall and it overwhelms you. It's a different kind of an experience.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about influence, which I mentioned before. I was intrigued by the idea of some Belle Epoque affiches, some French posters, having been influenced directly by some Japanese designs of some, I don't know exactly, 20 or 30 years before. And it seems fairly clear the way you position this that there is a design link, even for someone like me who doesn't pretend to have a deep understanding of this sort of thing. And my question is, well, how did that actually happen? Because I'm not sure there were more cultural links in the latter part of the 19th century than obviously in the 18th century or the 17th century. But still, it's a bit confusing to me to get an understanding of how that influence. I mean, it's one thing to always go back and say, well, there was an influence from here to there, but it's a little bit more confusing to try to get a sense of the mechanisms of what that influence might have been. So do you have any particular insights or perspective there?
I think in this case, it's the intersection of influence, but also the convergence of cultural ideas about word-image relationships and new media. So let me unpack that for a second. So we talked about movable type, and that movable type wasn't really viable in East Asia. Well, it's not totally true. When the Jesuits show up in Japan, circa 1600, with movable type equipment in the Roman alphabet, Japanese book designers get kind of interested in it. And Japan is different because Japanese uses kanji, which are adapted Chinese characters, but there are also syllabaries, which are characters which stand for a syllable. Much easier for people to read and helped the growth of literacy in Japan. So in the early years of the 1600s, there's an area in Japan where there's a printer who commissions the development of a hiragana typeface, a syllabary, which enabled typesetting from woodcut blocks in Japanese books. And for about 40 years, this is the thing. And in the book, I show examples of this. And you see this beautiful, lovely text opposite a page with an illustration on it, which it tends to be the way movable type works. It creates this logic of the text works one way and the image works another way. Well, after about 40 years, the Japanese said, you know what? Let's stop doing this. We want to go back to xylography. We want to go back to a world in which we can place text and image in fluid ways because we can draw it and cut it. And we're not stuck using these blocks of text. So the Japanese go back to xylography. The Chinese are still using xylography. So Japanese print designers and book designers develop this rich, over 2 centuries and more, this very rich visual culture of text and image by letting words and pictures interact in all kinds of ways. So when Matthew Perry shows up with his black ships in Edo Bay in 1854, the Japanese cry uncle and say, okay, fine, and you can come ashore. And the Japanese, having been very self-consciously closed off for more than 200 years, opens up to the West. Japanese prints, which have some of these characteristics that I'm talking about, begin to travel. And Japanisme is a real thing, especially in France. And that approach to building form and type and image is very different from the Western approach and is very stylish. In the meantime, lithography, which is invented in the 1790s, but kind of becomes a dominant medium from at least the 1840s, is a form that requires, it basically involves drawing on rocks, slabs of limestone. And there's no movable type. You just have to draw on the rock. And so French poster designers, and it starts as like little broadsheets and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, especially after Paris is bulldozed and the big boulevards are put in. a visual culture of lithography and advertising emerges in France in dialogue with this Japanese sources. And so it wasn't just that Japanese prints looked cool. It's also that lithography gave visual composers a medium which was enough like drawing as if for a block you were going to cut to think about lettering in new ways. So lithographic lettering is part of what makes this possible. So it's not just that Japanese prints emerged, but also those designers could see how Japanese designers were using type at different scales and integrating in an interesting way. So, I mean, the two images on the screen here, both of these spaces are very shallow, right? The visual field stops just behind the figure, and they're both kind of radically two-dimensional. And the way line and pattern and color are used is very similar. And in this particular case, the Japanese lettering isn't extremely prominent, but other prints of this time, some certainly could be. And this Bonnard print, which was a very influential design, the Franz Champagne it's a visual gesture all of its own, and that's a drawn thing. Nobody would set type that way. So there's an emerging kind of abstraction in the way that form is described, the way color is used. Lithographic printing, which color was a big part, chromolithography was a big deal. It allowed people to see color in new ways in the West. So the seeds of modernism we are looking at them.
Let me now ask something else. So having written this book and identified many of these really fascinating ideas and put them together in a unique, comprehensive, and stimulating way, are you happy with it? Is when you look back at this work now, do you say, okay, this was pretty good, but I really should have done this or that or the other thing, or has it lived up to your expectations? Did it turn out differently in some ways, or were you exposed to ideas and concepts that you hadn't previously imagined you would encounter?
I learned a lot about the first half of the 19th century that I didn't know. I think that was a period of time that is there's much more going on in it than I knew, and the fluidity of the idea of how illustration emerged, the back and forth between texts and images, and what an illustration even is. That was I was genuinely surprised by that. I learned some stuff about the late 19th century. Something I did not appreciate is that when Darwin publishes Origin of Species and uses the term race, no one actually knew anything about how heredity worked. Like, Mendel publishes his paper on pea plants like within 5 years of Origin of Species, and it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. Nobody reads it. And so for 40 years, when people used the term race, what they thought was being inherited were cultural traits. not individual ones. So, like, the amount of damage that was done by the pseudoscience of evolution and the terrible uses to which it was put, I didn't understand that, and that's amazing. So there were, moments like that that where I learned something about the history of ideas that I didn't know. I guess what I would say is that, I mean, it took me 4 years to do this book. And if I had been told at the beginning that it would take 4 years, I'm not sure I would have done it, but I'm very glad that I did. And what I will say is it was the best book I could have written. And I couldn't have written it 10 years ago. Like, I wrote it at the right time. And, there were images that didn't make it in the book that I really wished had. There were little disappointments. There were things that, I wish I could have kept that a little bit. And there was an ongoing tension between how much history writing was tolerable. Because my assumption is if you say World War I to somebody, they don't actually necessarily know anything about it. So I felt like if I was going to talk about a historical episode, I needed to tell the story to some degree of that episode. And, the editors were pushing back a little bit, like, okay, can we lighten up a little bit on the history writing? So that was a tension, but I think it was a very productive tension. And I respect and appreciate the arguments I lost, because I think they were right. I think I've said what I have to say on the subject. I think I've made a credible run at doing something that I think most writing about the subject has avoided doing, which is trying to draw a box around illustration and say, this is illustration and this is not. Right. Now, of course, I could be wrong, but even being wrong in an attempt to bring rigor to something has value.
Absolutely. So it advances.
I feel good about that. I want to write about other stuff next, but yeah, I'm glad I did it, and I did my best, and I'm comfortable with that.
Right. Well, it's a very provocative and stimulating book. Douglas, you've been very, very generous with your time. I appreciate it very much. I just have one more question. There are lots of things that we didn't have a chance to talk about that I actually had planned on talking about. You just mentioned race. Now I'd want to talk about racial stereotyping through illustration and the defining nature of the person. I'd wanted to talk about different aspects of gender. There are lots and lots and lots of things to talk about. But that being said, I wanted to ask you if there's something that you'd like to add specifically now that we haven't had a chance to talk about, or that you think needs to be emphasized or elided, or...
Yeah, there's one thing. Because illustrators have tended to live in a kind of shadow or a kind of anonymity, that they don't have the status of artists, and that, and they wish they did, and not all of them, but it's been an issue. There's always a little bit of a challenge of boosterism inside the field. That I understand it. I spent some time thinking about it years back, and now I'm really not interested in that. So, but the desire for illustration to be seen with in a certain light has, I think, caused the field to be a little less attentive than it might be into the harms that illustration has been engaged in, or that has caused. So the cultural memory, there's a chapter in the book on cultural memory, and it uses, to call them case studies is a little grand, but little episodes of the Jews of Europe and the Middle East, indigenous Americans, and blacks after slavery. And each of those groups of people was subject to depictions and narratives and ascribed qualities that were imposed to make them look bad, to weaken their position. And some of that was the written word, and some of that was visual. And that's also true that with the history of race stuff generally. And that stuff is rarely credited. And so there's been a tendency to just kind of, it would be better if we didn't have to look at that. I don't mean that explicitly. I just mean temperamentally. And so one thing that was important to me is I wanted to say this stuff. Part of the reason this stuff is important is because it is invisible. It doesn't have the status of art. So you don't look at it and stroke your chin. You just absorb it.
Right. And as you've been saying over and over again, cultural history may be beautiful, it may be liberating, it might be horrifying, but it's important to pay attention to it, because good, bad, or ugly, or good, bad, or indifferent, it is a core reflection of who we are, and and who we have been. And if we just sweep that stuff under the rug, then we don't have a clear understanding of not only who we came from and what we used to be, but to a large extent, what we might still, in the dark vestiges of our collective unconscious or even collective conscious, still be. Mm-hmm. At any rate, Douglas, I want to thank you very, very much for this very interesting discussion. And I want to thank you very much for your book. I enjoyed it immensely.
Well, thank you, Howard. I appreciate that very much. And I hope turning this into a useful episode from all our chatter won't be too difficult.
I just have to edit all my diatribes out. That's no problem.
I say, like, I'm glad to have heard your diatribe. Don't worry.
Thanks very much for watching this video podcast. For more engaging art-related content, check out our Exploring Art History Substack, our short films on our Exploring Art History YouTube channel, and Ideas Roadshow's full-length documentaries. Visit our website, ideasroadshow.com, for more details.